Let's do it. Frankenstein. I have been listening to the audiobook of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein classic. And if you haven't heard of Frankenstein or whatever, if you want the book link, it's in the description of the video. I've never read the book. I've never listened to the whole thing yet. But today there was a part that I wrote this note about, and I thought we would talk about it.
So, I don't know what the note is. This is new to me.
He doesn't know what it is. So Frankenstein, basically the story starts out and the guy's writing letters about his voyage into like icy waters and like across the ocean, basically to discover land or just kind of find new stuff. Like it didn't really clearly say it. It doesn't really clearly say it. But he finds someone in the ocean and it pulls out this guy out, and it turns out it's Victor, the scientist
that makes
Frankenstein.
Right.
And so after he kind of gets back to life and he's like able to talk again and stuff, he starts to tell this guy who's on this voyage about his story of making Frankenstein, or just like how he's like depressed and he's like in misery, and he's like, my miserable tale will save you from doing what I've done and searching for knowledge and, you know, playing with God and all that kind of stuff. So there's this one part in the audiobook or in the book where he's talking about stuff, and he talks about how he discovered how to create life out of inanimate objects, right, to spark life into something.
Mm-hmm.
And then he works days and days and nights without sleep, and he pushes aside people, he doesn't talk to anyone or whatever, and he gets obsessed.
Yeah, obsessive attachment.
Yeah, similar to Jekyll and Hyde, kind of, which is another audiobook I read or listened to. So he gets super attached to creating these monsters, or, you know, just creating stuff and trying to bring about the success and technique so that he could eventually create a living human being, you know, as complex as a human being or whatever. So he's doing whatever tests, and, you know, he's killing animals or like doing weird things, whatever's work, you know, just experiments. And then he talks about like how he he's like, someone should never pursue knowledge so much that they're disregarding contentment and peace, and their serenity, and I forget, you know, exactly how he says it, but basically he's like, never pursue a craft so much that it's actually doing worse to your soul, right? And he's like, if people followed that and lived that, then there'd be no wars, all this stuff, you know. And it's so true, and so important to remember, even though we get lost in, like, you say, for me, it's like drawing something for our story, and then I get, you know, flustered or something, maybe
worked up about it. Can't do it. I need to do it again.
It's like so, not cool. But then he says, "Forgive me, I am moralizing during the most important part of my tale. Let me, like, get back to talking about my story," you know? And I heard that and I was like, okay, like, in the story, what he's saying is the most important part of my tale is like creating Frankenstein, right? And that's super fascinating and whatever, right? But he's telling you a life lesson of, like, never get so sucked into your work that you lose your peace and your contentment. And I was like, so what is the most important part here? That's the most important part. Or, like, that's a really valuable lesson. He just skips over it, which, like, every single any story pretty much does.
Yeah, we've talked about it with, like, everything from the Captain America, skipping the important part for a montage to anything else. It's always the same.
So you have a story. It's got all these plot points, and then somewhere in there, like South Park perfectly satires this by just throwing the moral at the end of the show, like every time. It's just like
the whole point of all of this plot was this.
This is the moral.
Yeah.
But so like he skips over this moral and just says, "Oh, forgive me. Let me get back to the important stuff." And I'm like, no, like that's the important thing. And then the question further is, if the world was doing what he says, like there would be no wars and everything if everyone lived by this. If that world, if he was telling a story of that world, where like he himself did that and everyone did that, then what's the most important part of the story, right? And then I was like, okay, well I have an arrow going up, and it's like, okay, well it goes to depth. Depth would be the most important part of the story. What's the most like deep part of the story, or the coolest kind of stuff, or whatever. And when everyone's living life lessons and realizing, not to get lost in transitionary knowledge and just things that they could not get lost in, then the most important thing would be living the lessons that they would be living, and then the way that one learns these lessons, and also the joy in living all of it, would be the important part. If you didn't have to like take the moral out of the story, but if the moral was integrated into the story, you'd realize that the most important part of any story is like the learning of oneself and the lessons that it provides and everything like that.
Yeah, that's pretty common for just stories in general. Is like there's two completely different sides to this. One is like, if you learned all the lessons that Frankenstein was supposed to tell or meant to tell, then literally the only thing about the story of Frankenstein at all that could make any difference is the lessons, and people learning to apply the lessons by hearing the story of Frankenstein and being like, oh yeah, don't pursue this in obsessive ways and all this other stuff, and then like the world changes. This is literally the only thing that could ever change the world and make any difference at all to any single individual or people as a whole. It's the only one. And yet it's like shoved to the side to be like, here's the important part of Frankenstein. It's like, it's Frankenstein is pointless. You could put any other face on it, any other mask, change the characters, change everything. If this stays, you haven't lost the story. It's exactly the same story. You just it has a different face. It has a different name. That's it. The other side of it is basically like, if you have a story and then you share that story, like Frankenstein or any other movie or anything, and then as the like with just plot in general, is if that plot doesn't have that story behind it, like doesn't have the important part, like if it just told Frankenstein but it never showed that perspective at all, it has
without
no
any depth.
Like if you have the plot and you have the whole story of Frankenstein, but it never deliberately and directly dips into this, you never see his perspective of that. The whole story of Frankenstein and absolutely everything else is completely worthless to every single person on Earth. Like you could just throw it in the garbage and nothing would have changed.
If you reading that story or any of these other kind of horror stories, the kind of interesting similar character dynamics, it seems, is like there's always someone who's like, oh, I followed my possession, my attachment, and I was, overtaken by it, and
I invented this magic or
this stuff came out of it, whatever. But like, it's always like, this is what I was going through, and it was like really intense, and like I'm miserable, and I've, whatever
It's
this is that guy's story.
Obsession with the treasure, and after the treasure, it's like, what did you learn along the way? Like what was actually going on with your mental state as you're obsessing over this treasure? How did you get over it?
He talks about that, but if he's like, I just made a monster, he'd be like,
here's all the events that happened as I was making the monster, and now I'm here. That's it. It's like, what were you thinking when you did any of this? What were you feeling? What have you gone through that you can share with others? And if you leave that out at all, everything else is trash. And it's just like, you have to have that dipped in there. Like, it's the only way. So you have those two elements. That's the only thing that's important, and then you use that as context. And if you have anything as context, but you don't have anything important, then the context is worthless. So they fill into each other. Like, it's really hard to have that without that's we love stories and all that, and if it's just something like this without it, then you end up with those kind of monologues of like some really developed person that's really smart and intelligent talking about life lesson stuff, and you don't have the context there, so it doesn't stick as well. It doesn't. There's no like. Yeah. It's just okay. I get it. How do I live with this? How do I make the changes? And then if you have the context there, it's like okay, this is how a person is actually like. I can relate somehow. They're going through things. Things are happening, and they're acting.
There's never enough emphasis on the morals, and they're always like said to be something that's like, oh, this is a moral. Yeah. Take it or leave it, kind of thing. But it's like no, it should be integrated. It should be actually in the framework of what.
Like the story isn't told for the lessons, and then but it's always like people take the lesson out of the story and be like, yeah, there's a lesson in your story. This story was all about these lessons or something, because like you could take the lessons out and be like, yeah, this was the point. It's like no, the lessons are just in there. It's interwoven. It's the same thing. The story is like, nothing without the lessons.
Mary Shelley was aware of it and was like writing, forgive me for talking about the lesson.
Yeah, like the doctor talking about what he was going through is the story. Like it is the whole story of Frankenstein. That you could probably like if they just told the story through his perspective, and he never talked about Frankenstein or anything. It was all just like everything he's gone through, developed wise, or like everything he's learned and all his trials and errors of like just. How each one affected him or something. Yeah. That'd be a very full, complete story. You don't need the plot. But the plot, it could be just right there with it, because it's nothing without the story.
The way they did describe Frankenstein, though, like how it's written, of how his eyes are watery and like his mouth, super cool. I was like, yeah, that's awesome. Yeah. I see how he's an iconic character.
Yeah. That kind of stuff. That kind of stuff helps the lessons stick.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's why story is good. Yeah, Frankenstein.
Frankenstein.